Imagine you're living on a planet where, half the population is riding this high-speed elevator straight into the future.
Right.
They're living longer, earning more, learning more, basically pushing the boundaries of technology and medicine every single day.
Yeah, the typical progress narrative.
Exactly. But now, imagine that on the exact same planet, in the exact same year, an entire nation's timeline has essentially just stood still.
It's a really jarring contrast.
It is. And welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're looking at what you could call the ultimate macroeconomic scoreboard of human progress. We have this profoundly detailed presentation to unpack for you today.
Yes, it's titled Folded Development, a multi-dimensional perspective on Chad's human development dilemma and global inequality.
Right. And our mission today is to take this incredibly data-heavy source material and decode what it actually means for you, the listener, who's just trying to make sense of how the world really works.
And it's an important set of data because it forces us to confront the illusion of the global average. We love averages.
Oh, absolutely. They're comforting.
Exactly. Averages tell us this nice, comforting story of universal progress, but the sources we're unpacking today, they act almost like a structural autopsy of a nation that has been left entirely behind by that average.
Yeah, and I want to start right at the heart of this. The very first slide of the presentation throws out a massive hook. Why is there a country where time is frozen?
Right. It's a subversion of everything we assume about globalization.
So let's look at the numbers. By 2023, the Global Human Development Index, the HDI, it climbed to a high of 0.756.
And just for anyone who needs a quick refresher, the HDI isn't just about GDP.
Right, it's an index from the UN.
Exactly. And it measures three core things.
Yeah.
A long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
So at 0.756, the world looks like it's getting, a solid B-. Progress is clearly happening.
Generally speaking, yes.
But then, on this very same Earth, the nation of Chad has an HDI of just 0.416.
Yep.
Out of 203 countries tracked in this data, Chad ranks 200th. And here's the kicker. A staggering 84.2% of its population is trapped in multidimensional poverty.
Which means we really have to ask the uncomfortable question, right? Like, what systemic forces, what invisible barriers are keeping sub-Saharan nations like Chad locked out of the modern era?
Right, because when 84.2% of a country is in deep poverty, you're not looking at a normal economic dip.
No, not at all. You're not looking at a bad policy cycle. You're looking at a structural pathology.
So how does a nation's timeline just freeze like that? The second section of the presentation gives us this historical look back. It compares the global trajectory to Chad's from 1990 all the way up to 2023.
And the visual here is really striking.
It is. For the listener, picture a very simple 2D line chart. If you map out the global HDI over those 30 years, it's this relatively smooth, optimistic ascent.
Right. It starts around 0.6 and just steadily climbs up to that 0.756.
Yeah, we saw the rise of the internet, global trade expansion, massive leaps in vaccine distribution. The global line shoots up like an airplane taking off.
And that smooth curve represents the dominant economic assumption of the last half-century, which is globalization.
The rising tide lifting all boats.
Exactly. The theory is that global integration creates this development dividend. Basically, if the global north invents better medicine or generates massive wealth, that progress will naturally trickle down to the global south.
But Chad's line on this chart, it's essentially just bumping along the runway.
Right. It utterly demolishes that trickle-down theory.
Yeah, the data for Chad doesn't even really stabilize into a reliable tracking line until the year 2000, and it starts at a dismal 0.3003.
And from there, over the next 2 decades, it barely crawls to 0.416.
It's like the global north is riding a high-speed escalator, and Chad has been left to climb a broken, crumbling staircase. The absolute gap between the global average and Chad isn't closing at all.
No, it's widening. And what's fascinating here is that it proves time alone does not cure extreme underdevelopment, not without deliberate systemic intervention.
Because the rising tide theory assumes everyone is in the same ocean.
Right, with an intact hull on their boat. But a country like Chad is geographically landlocked in the Sahel region. It's dealing with the brutal legacy of colonial extraction, and it lacks the foundational state apparatus to capture any of that global wealth.
Wow. Okay.
Like when the global north invents a new mRNA vaccine, that technology doesn't magically build the refrigerated supply chains needed to deliver it across the Sahara.
Right, of course.
And without those supply chains, the global innovation is entirely useless to the person living in rural Chad. Time doesn't build supply chains, capital and infrastructure do.
That really makes the score of 0.416 feel a lot more tangible.
Mm.
But to truly grasp what that lack of capital does to a human life, the presentation peels back the HDI into its three underlying pillars.
Income, health, and education.
Exactly. And the researchers describe Chad's situation as a simultaneous triple collapse. Let's look at income first.
Sure.
The 2023 world average gross national income, or GNI, is $20,327. Chad's is a mere $1,748.
And we should definitely clarify for the listener how that is measured because it's calculated using purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Right. I see that acronym on the
Yeah.
side, PPP dollars. Explain the mechanism there because, $1,700 in New York is obviously very different from $1,700 in N'Djamena, Chad's capital.
Right, exactly. If we just use raw exchange rates, the data would be skewed by currency fluctuations. So PPP equalizes the playing field
How so?
by asking how much actual stuff like food, housing, basic goods can this amount of money buy in the local economy.
Okay, got it.
So when we say Chad's GNI per capita is 1,748 PPP dollars, we've already adjusted for the local cost of living. It literally means the average PDN possesses the exact same annual purchasing power that an American would have if that American tried to survive on $1,748 a year in the U.S.
Wow. That is an 11-fold gap from the global average. We hear numbers like this and they can start to lose their meaning. But when the income is that low across an entire population, what does that actually look like on the ground? I mean, my mind immediately goes to the state.
Right. How does a government even function?
Exactly.
Well, it barely does, and that's the crux of the issue. A nation's infrastructure is built on its tax base. If your citizens are generating an equivalent of $1,700 a year, the state's tax revenue is virtually non-existent.
You can't tax nothing.
Exactly. And without revenue, the government cannot issue bonds. Without sovereign wealth or reliable borrowing power, you can't build a national electrical grid.
Right.
You can't pave highways to connect farmers to markets. You can't subsidize modern agricultural equipment. That $1,748 figure represents an absolute absence of the safety nets and physical structures that define the modern world.
Which leads directly to the second pillar of this collapse, health. Because you can't build that infrastructure, the global life expectancy at birth in 2023 is 73.3 years.
Yep.
While in Chad, it is just 55.07 years.
Yeah.
You are essentially chopping almost 2 decades off a human life simply because of the geographic coordinates of their birth.
And losing 18 years of average life expectancy isn't just an individual tragedy. It fundamentally alters the sociological structure of the entire nation.
How do you mean? Like demographically?
Think about what happens between the ages of 55 and 73 in a developed nation.
Okay.
That's often when people step into roles as community elders, experienced mentors, senior administrators, or even grandparents who provide free childcare so the middle generation can actually go to work.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, when a population's life expectancy is capped in the mid-50s due to preventable diseases, malaria, malnutrition, you experience a severe deficit of intergenerational knowledge transfer.
Because the elders just aren't there.
Right. The sheer biological toll acts as a relentless tax on the society's capacity to mature and organize.
A tax on the society. That is a perfect bridge to the next major revelation in these slides. Because as abysmal as that 0.416 HDI score is, it's actually an overly optimistic number.
Yes, the inequality adjustment.
Right. The presentation applies something called the inequality-adjusted HDI, or IHDI. When you adjust for inequality, Chad's score suffers a massive 39.4% loss.
That's a huge drop.
It drags the real number down to a devastating 0.252. For context, the global average loss to inequality is only 21.9%.
Yeah.
The visual they use is this brutal waterfall chart. It starts at a modest 0.416, and then there's this giant red step that just plunges the number down by nearly 40%.
Why does Chad lose so much of its development to inequality when there's already so little wealth to begin with?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this phenomenon is known as developmental friction. The inequality-adjusted index penalizes a country's overall score if the gains in health, education, and income are hoarded by a tiny fraction of the population.
So the wealth is concentrated, hyper-concentrated. Even the meager resources Chad does have are hoarded or distributed so inefficiently that the average citizen sees almost none of it.
Let me stop you there because the data points out a specific number on this slide that absolutely blew my mind. It says the education inequality coefficient is 42.93.
Yes.
For the listener who isn't a statistician, what does an inequality coefficient of nearly 43 actually mean on the ground?
A coefficient like that indicates extreme monopolization. It means that if there is a functional school somewhere with trained teachers, electricity, and books, it is almost certainly located in a major urban center and serves the children of the political or economic elite.
And outside the city?
If you travel 50 miles outside the capital into the rural hinterlands, the educational infrastructure drops to absolute zero.
Wow.
There isn't just a difference in the quality of schools, there's a binary presence or absence of schools. The elite capture what little state capacity exists, and the vast majority of the country is left entirely in the dark.
And that leads directly into the third pillar of this collapse, education. Globally, we recognize education as the ultimate intergenerational poverty breaker.
Right.
It's the ladder out.
Yeah.
But in Chad, the data shows this ladder is missing almost all of its rungs. Let's look at the mean years of schooling, the MYS.
Okay.
In 2023, the global average was 8.775 years. That's essentially finishing middle school and heading into high school.
Right.
In Chad, the average is a heartbreaking 2.335 years.
And we really have to look at the velocity of that progress to truly understand the stagnation here.
This history is staggering. The presentation uses a dumbbell plot to visualize this. Back in the year 2000, Chad's average was 1.2 years of schooling. By 2023, it's 2.335.
So in 23 years, they've added roughly one single year of schooling on average.
Yes. In 23 years of global technological revolution, the era of smartphones, AI, globalized markets, Chad managed to add one single year of primary schooling. The research explicitly notes that the vast majority of citizens fail to even complete basic primary education.
Think about the macroeconomic implications of a population where the average person has not completed the second grade. You simply cannot build a modern nation.
Imagine trying to navigate the modern, digital, 21st century economy when you haven't even finished the second grade. You can't code, you can't read a complex technical manual.
You cannot train a domestic healthcare workforce to staff hospitals.
Right.
You can't cultivate an efficient administrative state to manage logistics or foreign aid. You can't build an industrial base because the workforce lacks foundational numeracy to operate modern machinery safely.
The whole system is just blocked.
The entire economy is permanently bottlenecked. When a nation is systematically deprived of literacy and numeracy, they're forced to import high-level labor from abroad. Foreign engineers, foreign doctors, foreign managers.
Which cost money they don't have.
Exactly, and it causes massive capital flight. Whatever money the country does make immediately leaves its borders to pay for the expertise it failed to cultivate at home.
Which brings us to a layer of the data that shifts this from an economic crisis to, honestly, a profound moral one. Because in Chad, being born is a statistical disadvantage, but being born a woman is double marginalization.
The double marginalization is severe.
The presentation measures this using the Gender Development Index, the GDI, and Chad ranks 191st globally. The female HDI is 0.365 compared to the male HDI of 0.464.
It is a society fundamentally folded against women. When you break down the economic and educational disenfranchisement, the gender gap is staggering.
Let's lay out the numbers for the listener, because here's where it gets really interesting. Female GNI is roughly half of men's. It's $12,247 for women versus $2,245 for men.
Right.
But the starkest contrast is the mean years of schooling. Females get an average of 1.334 years of education. Males get 3.545 years. That is nearly a 3 times gender gap in education.
Yeah.
Why 1.3 years? Like, what is happening at that specific age that pulls girls out of the classroom?
Well, 1.3 years of schooling basically means a girl is being removed from the educational system around age 6 or 7. So young.
And the mechanisms behind this are deeply cultural, but also heavily economic. In a society hovering at the edge of caloric survival, families are forced to make brutal economic calculations. If a family can only afford the minimal fees or opportunity costs to send one child to school, patriarchal norms dictate the boy goes.
And what happens to the 6-year-old girl?
She is immediately absorbed into the uncompensated domestic labor force.
Right.
She's fetching water, which in the Sahel can take hours of walking every single day. She's foraging for cooking fuel. And furthermore, the lack of basic infrastructure like safe, private sanitation facilities at schools means that even if a girl stays in school until puberty, the onset of menstruation often forces her to drop out due to a lack of hygiene products and privacy.
That's heartbreaking.
It is, but most crucially, pulling a girl out of school at age 6 or 7 is the preparatory step for early marriage. Her life trajectory is essentially locked at that moment. Which leads directly into the next slide, the Gender Inequality Index, the GII. And this is where the lack of education turns literal and lethal. The research exposes a severe maternal health crisis.
Yes, the GII data here is alarming.
The maternal mortality ratio, the MMR in Chad, is a staggering 1,063 deaths per 100,000 live births. The global baseline is around 216.
Wow.
And the adolescent birth rate is 134.7 per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19. The global average is around 39.
Yeah.
The presentation visualizes this by just having these massive, bold numbers towering over the tiny gray baselines of the rest of the world. It's impossible to ignore.
And these aren't just statistics. This is a catastrophic structural failure to protect a woman's most fundamental right to life. We really have to connect the 1.3 years of schooling directly to those 1,063 maternal deaths.
Walk me through that mechanism. How does leaving school at age 7 equal dying in childbirth at age 16?
When a girl is removed from school, she loses any institutional protection or alternative path to social value outside of childbearing. This leads directly to forced early marriage, which feeds that adolescent birth rate of 134.7.
Right.
Now, the biological reality is that a 15-year-old's body is often not fully developed enough to safely deliver a child. So combine that high-risk biological event with the $1,748 GNI we discussed earlier.
The absolute lack of state infrastructure.
Precisely. Because the state has no money, there are no paved roads from her rural village to a hospital. There is no ambulance. Because there's no electrical grid, even if she reaches a rural clinic, there's no power to run an incubator or sterilize surgical equipment for a C-section or refrigerate a blood bank for postpartum hemorrhaging.
It's just a total vacuum of care.
It is. The lack of medical intervention driven by macroeconomic poverty turns childbirth into a deadly gamble. An MMR over 1,000 means that every single time a woman gets pregnant, she is facing a very real, tangible percentage chance of death. It's devastating. And if women are facing this level of existential threat, my next question naturally is, who is at the decision table advocating for them?
Right, the political empowerment angle.
Exactly. The data explores women's economic and political empowerment, and this is where I actually found myself a bit confused by the slides. The research points out that female labor force participation is only 52.36%. lagging far behind men at 76.8%.
Which aligns with the education data.
Right. Given the lack of schooling and the maternal health crisis, that makes sense. But then the slide uses these donut charts to highlight what it calls a surprising bright spot. It says women hold 25.8% of parliamentary seats.
Yeah, the data does present that as a positive metric.
But wait, let me push back on this. 25.8% political representation at the national level actually sounds somewhat progressive compared to the other numbers we discussed. Is this a real victory for Chad?
This raises an important question, and it requires us to really exercise some critical thinking about how development metrics can sometimes create optical illusions.
Optical illusions? Yes. Having 25.8% of parliamentary seats held by women is technically a positive metric. However, we have to ask, who are these women, and what power do they actually wield?
You're suggesting a disconnect between the political elite and the grassroots reality.
A massive one. In many developing nations, increasing female representation in the national legislature is heavily incentivized by international aid organizations and global optics.
It looks great on the UN report.
Exactly. But these seats are overwhelmingly occupied by the highly educated, wealthy elite, the beneficiaries of that massive 42.93 inequality coefficient we discussed earlier.
Oh, right.
That top-down political representation does not magically filter down. A female minister in N'Djamena does not automatically translate into a paved road, a trained midwife, or a school for the 14-year-old girl who can't enter the labor force because she was married off and has no schooling. It highlights a severe disconnect between elite political optics and grassroots economic reality.
Which means we need a much better way to measure that grassroots reality. And the presentation provides one. The Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI. Because poverty clearly isn't just an empty wallet, it's an empty life.
Right. The MPI is perhaps the most accurate diagnostic tool we have for places like Chad.
The slide for this section uses what's called a waffle chart. For the listener, imagine a 10 by 10 grid, 100 squares. And 84 of those 100 squares are filled in with this dark, heavy gray.
It's a very stark visualization.
It really is. It shows that 84.2% of Chad's population lives in multidimensional poverty. And the intensity of this deprivation is 61.4%. The overall MPI value is 0.517.
Let's clarify what intensity means here because it's crucial.
Go ahead.
It means that the people who fall into this 84.2% category are not just missing one thing. They are deprived in over 60% of the measured indicators simultaneously.
Oh.
They lack clean water, and E, they lack electricity, and E, their children are out of school, and E, they are malnourished. It is a suffocating, overlapping web of lack. When 84.2% of a country lives this way, poverty is the norm, not the exception.
My first instinct when I picture multidimensional poverty is to assume it's mostly about physical living conditions.
Yeah.
You know, a lack of sturdy housing or a lack of safe cooking fuel. We always see images and documentaries of people cooking over open, smoky fires.
Right, that's the stereotype.
But the data deconstructs the MPI to find the root causes, and housing and fuel aren't the main drivers. The slide shows a horizontal bar chart, and cooking fuel only counts for 8.8% of the poverty index.
Yeah.
So what are the main drivers of this massive 84.2% poverty rate?
This is where the anatomy of deprivation becomes incredibly clear. The largest contributors to this poverty are years of schooling at 18.7%, school attendance at 17.9%, and nutrition at 14.4%.
Wait, really? So if you combine those,
Yeah.
just those three indicators, education and food, account for over 50% of the entire poverty burden.
Exactly. Over 50% of the cause of Chad's multidimensional poverty stems solely from a lack of education and a lack of food. It is the direct collapse of human capital.
That's incredible.
It tells international aid organizations and domestic policymakers a very hard truth. You cannot solve this by just building roads or giving cash. You have to feed and teach the children.
Right.
Everything else is secondary to biological survival and basic cognitive development.
Now, I want to pivot to a section of the presentation that I found to be one of the most intellectually provocative. It addresses the climate crisis through something called the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
Yes, the climate paradox. This is a relatively new and vital metric.
So it adjusts a country's development score based on its carbon emissions and material footprint.
Essentially, it measures who is consuming the Earth to achieve their high standard of living.
And the asymmetry here is just breathtaking. Chad's PHDI score is 0.397. Now, listen to these environmental metrics. Chad per capita CO2 emission is a microscopic 0.16 tons. The world average is 4.536 tons. And then there's the material footprint. The world average is 12.714 tons. Chad is just 8.09 tons. And historically, it's been much, much lower.
It reveals a massive global asymmetry.
Imagine a global banquet where a few guests eat the entire feast, but the bill is handed to the person outside who only caught a whiff of the food.
That analogy is painfully accurate. It's a bitter irony. Chad sits on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. It is one of the most climate-vulnerable regions on the planet.
Yeah, we've all heard about Lake Chad shrinking.
Exactly. So Chad is absorbing the brutal, direct punishments of a changing climate without having reaped any of the industrial high-carbon dividends that built the wealth of the global north.
And the presentation points out something crucial. Their incredibly low carbon footprint isn't a victory. It's not the result of some eco-friendly consciousness.
No, not at all. It is simply the manifestation of an absolute lack of infrastructure. They aren't emitting carbon because they literally aren't building anything.
Right.
A low material footprint just means a lack of cement being poured for hospitals, a lack of steel being forged for railways. The global north achieved its high HDI by burning fossil fuels. Expecting nations like Chad to somehow develop without massively increasing their energy consumption or without the global north subsidizing green infrastructure is a mathematical impossibility.
So how do we pull all these disparate threads together? The extreme lack of education, the maternal mortality, the multidimensional poverty, the climate vulnerability. The slide here synthesizes this into a concept it calls the systematic flywheel of the poverty trap. It's a causal loop diagram.
A flywheel is a great mechanical metaphor because a flywheel stores energy. Once it gets spinning, its own momentum keeps it going. Poverty in Chad is not a passive state. It is a self-sustaining engine.
Let's trace the loop for the listener. It starts with the extreme deprivation in basic education, especially for girls. As we discussed, they get 1.3 years.
Right.
That educational deprivation leads directly to high illiteracy and incredibly low labor participation, which fuels extreme poverty and malnutrition. The malnutrition in early marriage caused the sky-high maternal and child mortality rates,
Exactly.
which caps the national life expectancy in the mid-50s, which ensures continued economic stagnation and keeps the GNI at that abysmal $1,748. And because the GNI is so low, there is no money to build schools. Which brings us right back to the start of the loop.
Extreme deprivation in basic education. It just feeds itself.
So what does this all mean for someone trying to fix it? If you are a policymaker looking at this terrifying causal loop, where do you intervene?
You have to find the point of maximum leverage. You have to jam a stick into the spokes of this exact cycle.
But practically, what does that look like? The next slide outlines targeted solutions based strictly on the data, not broad ideologies.
Yes, and this is where precision is key.
The visual here is a target chart. The outer rings are things like infrastructure and clean energy, which are important, yes. But the red-hot center bullseye has two specific targets. Number one, nutrition interventions and maternal health care.
To drastically reduce that 1,063 maternal mortality ratio.
Right. And number two, extending foundational compulsory education for females.
Which directly attacks the 18.7% root cause of the MPI we saw earlier.
Why these two specifically? Why not prioritize building a massive solar farm first?
Because funding cannot be scattered blindly. By addressing female education and nutrition first, you disrupt the generational transmission of poverty at its biological and cognitive source.
It breaks the flywheel.
Exactly. If you educate a young girl and keep her nourished, you delay the age of marriage, which drops the maternal mortality rate. She enters the formal labor force, which boosts the GNI. That creates a tax base, which eventually pays for the solar farms.
It's incredible how clear it becomes when you trace the data step by step. We've reached the conclusion of this profoundly illuminating analysis.
It's a sobering reality check.
It really is. The final slide wraps up our data journey. It argues that the global average HDI of 0.756 is a comforting statistic, but it acts as a blanket covering a deep abyss.
Yes. Progress reports have no moral weight until the bottom 84.2% of a country like Chad breaks free from these chains.
As the source slide boldly states, the height of global development is not determined by breakthroughs at the top of the pyramid, but by the support at its base.
That's a powerful conclusion.
Which leaves me, and hopefully you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over. It extends beyond the explicit text, but is built entirely on its logic.
Okay, let's hear it.
If human progress has historically relied on the massive carbon emissions and material extraction that are now destabilizing the climate, and nations like Chad are suffering the physical consequences of that destabilization while trying to survive on $1,700 a year.
Right.
Does the global north's current definition of prosperity actually require places like Chad to stay folded and forgotten at the bottom? Think about what a truly shared planet would actually cost us.
That is exactly the uncomfortable question we have to keep asking.
Until next time, keep diving deep.